Brilliant. Thank you so much. Hopefully, I'm coming through loud and clear.
Yes, you
Just
are.
like
Yeah.
to say a big thank you to Tom and to Chris for having me here this evening where I am. It's a real privilege to be able to share some of these thoughts with all of you. So thank you so much for tuning in. I'm very aware, as I was when I gave this paper last year, that I am not a historian. That is not my background. I'm not trained in history, but I am a sort of very passionate reader of history, and I'm very aware that I'm sort of stepping into this realm where we've got lots of passionate people who know so much about this subject. So, in speaking today, I'm hoping that I can really offer some thoughts to reflect on, and learn myself really in engaging with what has been a really encouraging community, both in speaking last year and also joining you here today. As has been very helpfully highlighted, I currently serve as an army chaplain in the British Army, and everything I say today is of my own opinion and does not reflect the views of the Royal Army Chaplaincy Department or the Ministry of Defence. But it's a real pleasure to be here to consider, to what extent can we view Napoleonic imperial eagles and British regimental colours as icons, as spiritual icons in the age of enlightenment. I was just speaking to Tom and Chris earlier about, not only my passion for Napoleonic history, but also how I think, Napoleonic history is really relevant today. When the battalion that I serve with, when we deploy overseas, we take our regimental colours with us. And I'm using that term as a catch-all for both the battalion regimental colours and the King's colour. We take both of them with us. And on the regiment in which I serve, the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, we've got that history of Talavera and these other sort of big, significant peninsular battles. And, whenever I walk past, it reminds me of growing up having read sharp novels and Hornblower and all those other good things, Patrick O'Brien. And as a chaplain, my role is to support the unit in lots of different ways, pastoral, moral, spiritual care, contributing to what we refer to in the British Army as that moral component of fighting power. And a significant element of that is looking back into our history and taking courage and inspiration from the men and women that have gone before us. I know that a number of you watching possibly are involved in the reenactment world. It was really interesting to hear of Tom and Chris's experience of that earlier. I've never been a reenactor. I would love to. It's not something I've ever got around to. I have spent some time working as a TV extra before going into the military. And I did a shoot once with a TV firm. We were shooting Vanity Fair, the most recent production that's gone out. And we were doing the Battle of Waterloo, and it was really interesting to engage with the reenactors and hear about their passion and their interest. And they got us to form square and all these different military formations, and that was fascinating. But one other thing that I gleaned from that experience was one particular day we're shooting in a really wet and muddy field in somewhere in Reading, and they get us all to sort of present in square, and then they have 40 or so stunt horsemen and women, I believe, because lots of makeup, lots of costumes, dressed up as French cuirassiers charging at us. And I remember thinking, I know this is a TV set, I know that we're perfectly safe, but in the smoke's going, the noise and the thunderous sort of steps of these horses coming towards you, it gave me maybe less than a 1% insight as someone that was there as an extra for a few days on the set, to think, wow, how did these men, and obviously it would have been just men serving in these infantry battalions at Waterloo or at the Peninsula, how did they stand against such sort of terrifying odds, with all the smoke, the gunshots, the cavalry, what kept them going? And it's part of my job as a chaplain, serving troops now, in the British Army, to sort of support that moral component of fighting power, of looking at those values and standards of courage and integrity and loyalty and so many others, and where do we draw upon for strength, for the ability to push forward when things are difficult. And as a chaplain, I'm naturally going to make the case that part of that is spiritual. I'm very deliberately using the word spiritual, not religious. They are, I would argue, two different terms. I'm obviously, draw strength from my religious identity. But even if I were to encounter someone that doesn't necessarily have a religious affiliation, I'm content to use the word spiritual as respectfully as possible, because for me and for so many others that have written on similar topics as to what I'm presenting, to talk about spirituality is to draw upon what are those foundational things that help me form my identity? How do I understand what it is to be courageous? How do I understand a virtuous understanding of loyalty? What does it mean to be loyal? There are toxic and positive versions of all these different things. And we want to be the best that we can possibly be. So I'd like to very briefly today explore some of that very lightly in reflecting upon spiritual icons in the age of the Enlightenment as eagles and colours. It was great to watch one of the previous videos with the excellent Graham Callister speaking on recruitment in Napoleon's army. And I'm very aware I'm going to be doing a slightly different style. And I'm very happy to take questions as we go along. So if Tom or Chris see particular questions pertinent to what I'm talking about, I'm very happy to take a pause and to discuss them. So this paper will consider the role that Napoleonic battle standards performed amongst soldiers of the British Army and the Grande Armée. I'm going to mostly focus on British regimental standards, as that's more my background, but it'd be good to reflect upon how the French viewed their eagles as well. I'm going to do this by examining the wider spiritual context that surrounded soldiers and officers of both forces, principally considering how various historical and cultural developments imbued their respective standards, whether it was Italian colours or the eagle, how it imbued those things with spiritual worth. I will conclude that even during the latter end of this age of enlightenment, there resides a strong spiritual foundation to the profession of soldiering, and that this foundation was made manifest in a particularly strong way within the regimental standard, whatever that looked like. Before we consider British and French forces and their relationship with spiritual iconography, I'd like to begin with an altogether different battlefield, as you can hopefully see on the screen now. On the 7th of September 1812, the Grand Army of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte and the Imperial Russian Army of Tsar Alexander I engaged in one of the bloodiest battles of the age, the Battle of Borodino. Taking place 70 miles west of Moscow, this action was a set-piece battle in what would turn out to be Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia. However, for the thousands of Russian soldiers who had watched their cities burn and whose feet had trudged many miles in retreat, the ultimate failure of Napoleon's campaign felt far from certain at this time. The Russian army was in dire need of a morale boost. As Russian generals certainly would have agreed, it was clear that further steps had to be taken to strengthen their moral component of fighting power. The Grande Armée had swept away all before them, and the steely ranks of France's Imperial Guard had yet to be let loose. It was concluded that the Russian soldier would need more than a rousing speech to boost his morale. What was needed was a spiritual awakening. So that morning of the battle, Orthodox priests led a procession of an icon famed for its sacred significance. The golden image of Our Lady of Smolensk was processed through the Russian army, passing by soldiers and officers who prostrated themselves in reverence to the icon and in preparation for a day's fighting that none of them would forget. Now, ultimately, the Battle of Borodino would leave Napoleon in command of the field. And yet the tenacity of the Russian army and the ferocity of its troops had made the French emperor pay for his victory at such great cost that he would never truly recover. His enemy had withstood cannon fire and cavalry sabres and persisted with what might be termed a spiritual fervor. The previous year, many miles away in Spain, at the Battle of Albuera, Ensign Edward Thomas of the Buffs sought to rally his own battalion in a very different conflict by calling them to assemble around the regimental colours. As the redcoats faced the relentless assault of enemy cavalry, he refused to surrender his colours, being killed even as he held them, with several members of his company also slain in their defence from different ranks. The same story was repeated several times across the Iberian Peninsula, with red-coated soldiers even breaking formation to protect and retrieve their colours. A similar account can be found amongst French forces in Spain, with soldiers and officers going to extraordinary lengths to protect their golden imperial eagles. The religious reverence that so inspired Russian soldiers at the sight of their great icon was not quite the same as that which spurred young Ensign Thomas to sacrifice his life. Again, probably talking more about spirituality rather than outright religious devotion to a standard compared to an orthodox icon. Neither did the French soldier relate to his shimmering eagle, touched by the hand of Napoleon himself, in quite the same way. Yet each totem of battle, the icon, the flag, the eagle, contained within them values that far suppressed any physical worth they could have had. These battle standards constituted a tangible manifestation of a battalion's identity, and thus the identity of the individuals that served in those battalions. As a chaplain, I spend most of my time working amongst young soldiers, and that is a tremendous blessing. And they do care about the regimental history, tattoos of various battle honors, or especially amongst the battalion which I work in, flintlock tattoos and other things that point to regimental history are not uncommon. And so soldiers do relate some aspect of their identity to the battalion in which they serve. This sense of identity provided a unique motivation amongst soldiers of different nations to endure tremendous physical risk. To me, unimaginable physical risk as a deliberate means of partaking in their nation's grand narrative, which would have been impossible for them in civilian life. Any of us now can go onto Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, or Facebook, and we can immediately share our opinions with the world. And again, speaking to you now, many of you residing in Canada and sharing these opinions now, I'm able to project my thoughts and my identity on quite a wide stage, comparative to those of the 19th century. Whereas for soldiers, if they want to partake in their nation's grand narrative, they want to express some form of identity or purpose, there is no social media to do that. But many of them find that by serving in their nation's military. It's not necessarily why they join, probably not at all why most of them join, but in their letters, in their communications, they do take some pride in the campaigns in which they're serving. Participation in this narrative allowed them to engage with the metaphysical virtues of courage, loyalty, and even righteousness, and we'll get to that later, which aroused for them a care for these regimental standards, which was nothing less than spiritual. Now, the peoples of France had a long heritage, and we're going to look at the French context very briefly first. The peoples of France had a long heritage of relating significance to these military signifiers. The legions of Julius Caesar had suppressed the people of Gaul under the watchful gaze of their own imperial eagles, clutching the thunderbolt of Jupiter, as Napoleon would later replicate, leaving such an imprint on the tradition of Western warfare that the same standard would persist for many, many generations. William, the Duke of Normandy, later William the Conqueror, had set sail from the coast of Normandy with a war banner which had been blessed by the Pope himself. The Duke of Normandy had made the case to the pontiff that his invasion of England in 1066 was indeed a holy war. And it was the unfurling of this standard at Hastings that reminded his troops that their cause was a righteous one, blessed by the vicar of Christ himself. The kings of France had lavished with their opulent palaces and golden flutter of fleur-de-lis, galvanizing a robust national identity that over the years had faced down the might of medieval England, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Italian city-states. This all took place under banners which proclaimed France, with good reason, as the powerhouse of Europe for many centuries. Many years later, the French Revolution and the tyranny of Robespierre had produced for France a national icon of a very different kind, the guillotine. The locked social hierarchy of the Bourbons and the three estates was now a thing of the past at this point in history. But with its monarch now gone and the streets of Paris now terrorized by the very weapon which had removed the king, would the rather abstract notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity really be enough to rally the French fighting soldier? With that great symbol of the guillotine looming so large in Paris, is that something really you're going to rally around in quite the same way? It is true that the French army went on to win unlikely victories in these tumultuous years. Certainly before Napoleon appeared, victories were won, most notably in northern Italy and elsewhere. However, Was this due to an army that truly possessed a strong, cohesive identity, manifested in the will to fight? Or can we find better reasons for why, once Napoleon appears, this army galvanizes into something very different? And of course, we could now expand into talking about various military reforms and other things, but I really want to focus on the military standard element. In a vacuum of chaos and blood, the imperial eagle, introduced in 1804, of the now Emperor Napoleon, gave the French warrior a now very different motivation than he could ever have dreamed of. Historian John A. Lynn has written on the relationship between French imperial eagles and the imperial honors system. Whilst the guardianship of an eagle standard in combat, it didn't automatically confer a promotion or material reward, it was emblematic of many of those virtues. It was emblematic of an army that now prized, and very publicly prized, certainly in an idealistic sense, merit more than ancestry. For many competent soldiers, the revolution had offered a previously unattainable opportunity to rise through the ranks and even gain a commission. Once Napoleon made himself Emperor of the French, this system of meritocracy only increased, argues Lynn, amongst others. Several of Napoleon's own marshals had joined the army at a junior rank, with Jourdan beginning as a private himself, and found that competency on the battlefield could swiftly be rewarded with promotion and other honorifics in a way that had not been true before. While such lofty appointments they were not attainable for all, the acknowledgement that such promotion was now far more possible, and that courage on the battlefield offered up more opportunities for advancement than ever, has now permeated the psyche of the French army, an army which now marched under a radically different standard, that French imperial eagle, so intimately tied in with the person of Napoleon himself. Whilst many in Europe would soon look upon the eagle as a symbol of tyranny, for the French soldier, it became the spiritual heart of a very different style of leadership. Unlike the chaos of the revolution, this leadership did not offer the guillotine in one hand and advancement in the other in the same way. Rather, it was bound up in the identity of a leader who, through devices such as the eagle, would present himself as an heir of Julius Caesar, who himself had been declared a demigod not long after his death. To march in tandem with the unbending will of Napoleon, the conqueror of Italy and the victor of Austerlitz, was to unite oneself with the spiritual destiny of the French people, that of both liberty and conquest. This attitude was best exemplified following Napoleon's escape from Elba after his brief exile in 1814. The once again royalist France now braced itself, unsure as to what sort of conflict might break out as the emperor returned. And as his forces began to approach Paris, we read in those accounts of a fresh rejection of the nation's seemingly corrupt monarch spilled over, and eagles that had been carefully hidden after Napoleon's previous defeats now began to appear from the most unlikely places. Having previously been held aloft at the head of battalions, these treasured totems of once great imperial power had been secured and hidden under beds and beneath floorboards, only to make a stunning re-emergence as soldiers and officers alike returned and defected for their emperor's cause en masse. Having very briefly reflected upon the French perspective in this regard, I'd like now just to switch fire over to the British military. Looking out across the dusty shrubland of Salamanca to see his foe standing proudly under these lofty eagles, the British soldier was part of an altogether different cultural narrative. This was not the new model army of Oliver Cromwell, well stocked with pamphlets lined with Bible passages and spurred on by the fiery sermons of Puritan pastors. Like the armed forces of every nation, this army had experienced great upheaval, numerous reforms, and held a mixed reputation at home. Even the term British was not as widely used as it would later become in following years, with soldiers being far more likely to identify as English, Irish, and Scottish. This mixed heritage sometimes produced frictions, understandably amongst Irish soldiers whose communities had suffered so much bloodshed and unrest, often at the hand of redcoats. Members of the Catholic community, both Irish and otherwise, also found significant restrictions on the expression of their own religious and spiritual identity. And yet soldiers from both groups gave exemplary service in what was known cohesively as the King's Army, or had come to be known as. And serving under the King's colours were units such as the Enniskilling Dragoons and the Connaught Rangers. These units served with great distinction, despite being from a different community than that of the majority of English soldiers would have come from. Despite this complex heritage, those redcoats who contended with Napoleon's marshals in Spain were still the heirs of their forebears who had won victories at Dettingen and Blenheim. Mindful of their unit identity and eager to uphold the dignity of the unit in which they served, they had a fierce pride that they held for this identity, bestowed upon them and given to them by their regiment. And this was most prominently illustrated by the defense of their regimental colours, as well as the conquest of their opponents' dearly prized eagles. We'll look at that in a few minutes. Now, one particularly striking example of this must be the account of Ensign Christie of the 44th Foot's defence of his own regimental colour during the Waterloo campaign. Having suffered several grievous wounds at the hands of mounted lancers, including the loss of an eye, he committed and continued to persist in defending the silk flag, even to the point of covering it with his body as the horsemen trampled around him. Actions such as this by Christie and others point to the fact that soldiers and officers of these infantry battalions had a care for their colours that went beyond their utility as a rallying point. And certainly, I'm never going to deny at this point that there was a very utilitarian and functional aspect to the colours, especially on a battlefield in which it was so easy to become disoriented, for smoke and for noise to help one feel a bit lost and at sea almost. And the colours are a very good way of marking a rallying point, especially when battalion formations are so crucial to that battalion's survival. And yet, if an ensign or a colour sergeant or member of another rank is willing to physically hide the colours in a jacket or whatever, there's clearly a value to them that goes well beyond this utility. And as I've said, Napoleonic battles were wrought with smoke and noise. And those of you in the reenactment community will have had far better exposure to the simulation of that than I have. And so the use of such colourful standards as marking a clear point of assembly should not be underestimated. However, it should be noted that such actions by junior officers were only taken once they were surrounded by the bodies of several non-commissioned officers. This passion for protecting the colours was something that the first-hand accounts clearly illustrate was impacted and felt by all ranks. When a regimental standard was lost, it was something that affected the morale of everyone, not simply the officer corps. Both the King's colour and regimental colour were treasured by all ranks, who in their wartime exertions found themselves united in a common struggle to which the civilian world back home during this time period had no parallel. Even in moments of disasters, the colours remained a priority. When the 69th Foot were mistakenly ordered to form line at Quatre Bras and swiftly cut down by French cavalry, their King's colour was soon carried away by one of the horsemen. Ensign Clark of the 69th, his battalion seemingly now broken, and many of his sergeants already dead at his feet, suffered over 20 wounds in order to retain the unit's regimental colour. Now, this incident shed some light on the weight of shame that surrounded the loss of such a colour. Upon reading about such events, it's clear that the tremendous loss of life suffered by a unit whose cohesion had been lost and who had been forced in retreat, even during such an episode of potential disaster on the battlefield, the loss of the colour still remained something that was shocking and scandalous to the British soldier. So they would do their utmost to try and retrieve and secure it, even going beyond tactical necessity, which is really interesting. Even in this age of enlightenment, where the individual rights of men were being trumpeted from Washington to Paris, and the rejection of traditional modes of authority were openly discussed, the importance of the king's colour weighed heavily upon the British soldier. Samuel Coleridge, a contemporary poet and I'm sure well heard of theologian of the period, wrote that in this age of war, speaking specifically about the Napoleonic period, the spiritual fervour of the English soldier was the death of rampant individualism, especially religious individualism. That there was something about the regimental standard that pulled troops into a grander corporate identity. For Coleridge, religious commitment centered around the established church and was an essential element of national unity. It was this unity, especially from the British perspective, with the threat of revolutionary ideals coming from France, it was this sense of social unity, with soldiers and officers being drawn from very different social groups, which brought soldiers into a cause that was greater than their individual needs and committed them to the defence of the state, so that all might benefit. This stood in sharp contrast to the sweeping discussions in the wider philosophy of the time, which saw the needs and rights of the individual as taking precedent in many cases over that of the state. This debate was alive both in Europe and even in the territories of the United States, where debates around figures such as Thomas Jefferson raged on how the authority of a centralized state related to the liberty of the individual citizen. Many in Britain shared a great sympathy for the rediscovered rights of man, the rediscovered rights of the individual, whilst others looked down upon such revolutionary sentiments as they would have been viewed as close to treasonous, especially with French armies having once been poised to invade England. However, it seems that for many British subjects, the cause of king and country, despite these sweeping philosophical revolutions that were occurring at a time where people were reassessing the nature of their national identity, for many British subjects, the cause of king and country remained an essential narrative to which they would commit themselves, both physically and spiritually. Since James I, the monarch was stressed to have been divinely appointed by God in a way that hadn't been stressed quite in the same way prior to his reign. There was a new sort of rebirth of that idea of the divine right to rule. Even for the most unchurched members of the military, this heritage from James I going down to his successors, and through that there remained a sense in which to serve the king was in some way in the British identity to engage with the divine. And rarely was this more pronounced in the army than the defence of their colours. So we see this sort of philosophical shake-up that's as a result of so many different factors, the American Revolutionary War, the French Revolutions, all these sort of different narratives about how individuals relate to the state, can be sort of viewed as having an impact on how people viewed their sort of battle standards. For the French, we have this sort of new sense of liberty and career progression. For the British soldier, there's almost this sort of pride in, we're not quite subscribing to these continental ideals. We still have this sort of firm foundation of king, God, and country. The colours themselves were imbued with both a culturally and spiritually and overtly religious significance. As with the British Army today, Napoleonic regimental colours were consecrated and blessed by an army chaplain. Ordained ministers were nothing new to the Army of England and the wider British Isles, with numerous campaigns having been waged on those islands and priests walking beside soldiers for many centuries. With the final formation of the then Army Chaplains Department, which wouldn't yet earn its royal prefix until the service of chaplains in the First World War. But the Army Chaplains Department formed in 1796 under Reverend John Gamble. Official army chaplains would now accompany British troops across the globe, including the Peninsula and including during the 100 Days campaign and Waterloo. Now, there was a notable shortage of chaplains during the Peninsular War in particular, especially in Spain. And Wellington, as commander, requested that more Anglican chaplains be deployed amongst his troops to help manage the sentiments of a growing Methodist movement amongst the army. Now, thankfully, the Royal Army Chaplains Department of today is a diverse group of ministers working from many different denominational backgrounds, including colleagues from other faiths as well, which is a real blessing. But in the Peninsular War, we have this very interesting narrative from Wellington, who is seeing this Methodist revival impacting his soldiers, especially equipping non-commissioned officers to speak about virtue and morals and ethics in a new radical way, as Methodist preachers encourage them in the way of living biblically, abstaining from unnecessary violence, abstaining from excessive drinking. And Wellington, we get this concern from Wellington that, hang on, I can't have my sergeants educating my junior officers on what it is to live virtuously. I'm not comfortable with that. And so Wellington deliberately requests that Anglican ministers be sent, because he has this view that Anglican ministers will somehow subdue this sort of evangelical Methodism that's sweeping through his army, which is, again, probably a topic for another paper, but a very interesting perspective there on how senior military officials viewed different religious groups. And by many accounts, the Duke encouraged a healthy spirituality amongst his soldiers, spoke highly of his own chaplain, the Reverend Samuel Briscoe, who was his own personal chaplain, and he was a regular attendee of divine worship. However, the Duke desired that such worship should be properly ordered. He gave Briscoe very set timings that he could not preach over, and very much wanted orderly worship, which again it impacts our understanding of why he may have requested Anglicans in particular, because of that set liturgical structure under which they would have operated. And he was wary of growing evangelical ministry amongst his soldiers. And when the Duke's new Anglican chaplains did arrive, they would conduct divine services before whole battalions in presence of the colours, further cementing the notion that regimental life, the regimental colours, and the regimental system was built upon a rock of spiritual convictions. And that seems so core to the way in which chaplains were used to affirm the sort of identity of battalions, to bless their colours, to preach about the virtues which surrounded the regimental standards, and then troops would go on to fight with great passion for the regimental standards. And again, this is something that we continue to reflect upon in the British Army. I skipped over a slide there, taken from a slide package that I use to teach current serving personnel. And this is from a very different conflict. This is from Field Marshal Slim, serving in Burma in the Second World War. And as a very practical man, as a man that demanded victory above so much, he came up with this wonderful statement, and you can read that in his book about defeat into victory. Writing, these foundations of morale are spiritual, intellectual, and material. And that is the order of their importance. Spiritual first, because only spiritual foundations can stand real strain. And it's really worth reading, no matter what period of history we're looking at, Slim's understanding of a need to have a spiritual foundation to war fighting, understanding what it is to fight for a noble cause, and that's how he articulates it. He has a very passionate belief in right and wrong, in good and evil, and he believes manifesting a spiritual fervour amongst his troops is quite important. And that's not a fervour which is seeking to proselytise or convert or anything in that sense, but a spiritual passion which affirms traditional notions of courage, of virtue, of honour, of all these different things. And that's something we see right through, echoed in various elements of the Napoleonic War right now to modern day war fighting. We want troops to operate with moral courage, absolutely essential. And to properly operate with moral courage, we need to understand the foundations of that moral system. And so the Duke of Wellington continues to suggest that spiritual instruction is important, but it must be properly ordered. Even in the great developments which have marked the evolution of warfare from 1805 to the present day, the need for spiritual support to go to war remains. And if the evidence of what we're seeing in contemporary conflicts is anything to go by, actually spirituality is becoming even more of a conversation. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Royal Army Chaplains Department has been directly involved in training new cohorts of Ukrainian chaplains to support their troops on the front line. Now, during a conference on the ever-changing face of modern warfare, held at the Armed Forces Chaplaincy Centre, Beckett House, last year. Ukrainian academics came and they spoke emphatically about the ever-expanding industry of religious icon painting that has grown amongst Ukrainian soldiers as the war has continued. The technology of war fighting has changed dramatically, but even in these modern conflicts, there are signs of spiritual rejuvenation of spiritual conviction. And whilst, of course, the British Army hasn't carried battle standards in the way that it did at Waterloo since the late 19th century, and certainly there's obvious reasons why that's not possible or advisable now in Ukraine. But the idea of a spiritual icon, of even a overtly religious icon, it is clearly contributing to their service personnel's moral component of fighting power. And Ukrainian academics spoke to us about how troops are painting body armor plates and their ammo boxes with various traditional Orthodox iconography and drawing some reservoir of courage and support from that iconography, which is really interesting. Now, these spiritual convictions are themselves framed within the light of their own evocative emblem, and that's the cross of Jesus Christ. And I've spoken already about how troops valued their own battle standards, but it's clear that actually it goes a bit deeper than this. And actually there's something particularly that the Christian tradition bestows upon soldiers, which makes the nature of religious military battle standards as something to particularly hold on to. Because in the Christian tradition, the icon of the cross is so absolutely key. Since the earliest days, Christians have adopted the very instrument of their Messiah's death as an icon for reverence. And you can see that in the picture of one of our Ukrainian colleagues there. It is for this reason that crosses adorn churches and are worn by many who follow the teaching of the resurrected Jesus as an ever-present reminder of the theme of victory, and that victory can be won even in the jaws of defeat. And this would have been a common preaching point for chaplains serving in the peninsula, for chaplains serving at Waterloo, because it's such a foundational element of the Christian story that even in the midst of fear and defeat, victory and hope is possible. And that's ultimately what the cross represents. And then in an intriguing parallel to this, British regiments were not only content merely to bear their own colours proudly aloft, but would also parade with the captured eagles of their enemy. And this slide, for me, and this is a direct question for me to your audience, Tom and Chris, I'm only aware of one item that possesses quite this story, and that's the picture of the wooden Imperial eagle on the right-hand side of my screen. I'm not aware of another military historical artifact as having this, and I'd be really intrigued if there are other examples of this, and I'll go into that now. Some units went slightly further in embracing the iconography of a defeated enemy. At Salamanca, the 44th Foot took a French eagle to great acclaim. A few years later, the same 44th Foot served at the Battle of Quatre Bras in 1815. This same battalion gained further recognition for holding at Quatre Bras the vital crossroads against French forces. Purportedly, after the crossroads were held, an essential part of Wellington's ability to then reform his military during the ridge, along the ridge later at Mont-Saint-Jean. After holding this vital crossroads against French forces, something interesting happened. Purportedly, soldiers from the 44th Foot, now the Royal Anglian Regiment, carved an eagle out of the wood from a nearby farmhouse, a farmhouse that they'd used in the crossroads defence. This plainer eagle, of which there's a picture on the screen, now sits beside its golden neighbour in the Essex Regimental Museum in Chelmsford, which you can go and see today. Now, it symbolises not only victory won at Salamanca 3 years previously, but also the continuing martial pride that the regiment displayed at Quatre Bras and later at Waterloo. It had been retained as an icon of what it means to face a superior foe, to contest with the reality of death, and still to emerge victorious, even when outnumbered. In addition to parading with their unit colours, Royal Anglian soldiers also wear the symbol of this captured eagle even on their uniform today. It's still forming an integral part of their identity as a regiment. The identity that soldiers of Wellington's army fought so hard to protect and exemplify would sadly change not long after the battle itself. And sadly, this identity that soldiers held on to once the 100 Days campaign was finished, once soldiers were decommissioned, this sense of pride, the sense of partaking in the nation's grand narrative sadly waned and was impossible to sustain once the Waterloo campaign was over. Yes, it would persist on those personnel that continued in service. Yes, it would continue in the service of those battalions that carried on that history. But for those that would then leave the army and go back to civilian life, sadly, the narrative would change very significantly, especially for some of them. And this is drawing close to my final point on this topic. In the years that followed, Great Britain experienced a significant economic slump after Waterloo, with many veterans of Talavera, Salamanca, and Waterloo finding themselves out of work and destitute, and struggling to maintain a living on the streets of London, Birmingham, and Manchester. Stripped of their uniforms, and with some receiving only a pitiful war pension, the misery of their situation soon developed into a clamour for social reform. And this would lead into what would famously become known as the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester, 1819. It's probably one of the most famous expressions of this yearning for electoral and economic reform that was shared by many veterans of Wellington's army, and of the deadly violence with which it was resisted. Now, desiring a greater share of voting rights and reforms which would protect and empower workers, some of those who took part in this march in what would later be known as Peterloo, they were veterans, as I say, of Waterloo. They now found themselves marching with banners, often with songs, alongside a body of workers in a very different struggle. Their procession and assembly were notably marked by their own standards, now no longer battalion standards, but standards of a very different kind, but still standards which spoke to their identity as workers, as those who were members of local communities, as those who were struggling for their rights. They found a new expression of identity that they felt it necessary to put into some sort of standard to be borne aloft. And it is particularly tragic that some of those cavalrymen who were then sent to resist those very same veterans were themselves also veterans of Waterloo. Now, these two groups were now divided by the persistent enemy of economic depravity that would continue to prove a far more pernicious foe to Great Britain and Ireland than Napoleon ever would. So, with the war now over and the battalion colours now resting in the hands of a peacetime army, those who had once dared to capture eagles and even face down the ranks of Napoleon's immortals were forced to take up a very different role in their nation's grand narrative. They now served a cause that, despite walking their own city streets, may have felt far less tangible to them than it did on the dusty plains of Spain or the mud-strewn squares of Waterloo. Local churches would still enable veterans to engage with aspects of the divine, but never again would they be so drawn to stand in defense of a uniting spiritual ideal, and greater than that, a uniting spiritual identity than they did so on campaign under their own colours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stuart. Maybe you can stop sharing your screen, and then that way the audience can have a better look at all of us here in the studio. Perfect. Chris just put the call out for questions there. And Chris usually has some questions, but I'm going to sneak in first. So my understanding is for the Imperial Eagles, part of their mystique was that Napoleon personally presented a regiment with the eagle. Was it equivalent for the British Army with their colors? Was there a member of royalty or someone that would present the colors? You described them being consecrated by a chaplain, but in terms of who actually presented a regiment with the colors?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's a really good question, and still something I'm looking at. That we don't have very clear lines drawn on that. I mean, when Napoleon presents the first eagles, and we know that he definitely presents the first eagles in 1804, it seems then there's a continuing tradition that he presented every eagle. I think there are some questions there, certainly in the sources that I'm reading, whether he then did actually present every eagle afterwards. It seems like in 1804, when he does it for the first time, he's cementing that identity that, look, I am walking in the tradition of Caesar, of Alexander the Great, and I want you to defend these things with your lives, because you're defending the ideals of France. You're defending these ideals of new progressivism, of a new order of things. And so it's very important that for him that he has it recorded very early on that he presented them in 1804. Whether or not he continues to do that with the same consistency, I think is a wider point of discussion. With the king's colour, I mean, certainly with the king's household, there's a great connection there with the guards, that the king is present during the presentations. With regards to other ranks, I've not other battalions, I've not actually come across confirmation that they were always presented by the king. We certainly have a narrative there of the king being present with the guards units and the household units, which would make sense. But it's a really good question. I would need to do further reading about the other battalions.
Yeah, I'd wondered about that. I look at the 41st Regiment, which were in Canada in 1799, but then with I guess bringing Ireland into the Union, and then the Union Jack change that would have necessitated new colors while they were still in Canada, like, where they shipped to them and then the Governor General present them, or that was something I've always sort of wondered about. So, okay, cool. Chris, I'll let you go. So,
thank you. Just the one, Tom. Usually you.
well, I got more, but I'm not going to hog Stuart's time. So,
I wanted to say first, I really appreciate the distinction you've made between spirituality and religion, which certainly sometimes overlaps, but certainly sometimes is very distinct. So I appreciate that. But I did want to ask specifically about religion in the Peninsular War, and we know there's this. Creeping Methodism is sort of the way it's often described, not entirely positively, and then we have certainly Catholicism, especially among the Irish troops. But would you characterize religion, the average soldier, as particularly religious outside these very narrow windows? Do you think, like, was it spirituality aside? Do you think they were particularly religious?
So, I mean, that's an excellent question, isn't it? I think to sort of answer that in a sort of sideways route, I don't think they would have conceived of the secular in quite the way that we would now. So I think that sort of division between I'm religious and I'm secular, we don't really have that many accounts that I've read, and that's been my main source of reading, is looking at the letters that troops have sent back, and we've got a lot more letters from the 100 Days campaign, certainly ones that talk about God, and that language of by God's grace, or by God's favor, Emily, I'll return to you. Soldiers write to their wives and to their mothers. And so it's clear that some historians interpreting this go, well, they're using that God language in their personal correspondence. The ones that can write, and some can, especially the 100 Days campaign, got quite a few. But they're writing those letters because they've been educated at church schools, because it's churches really providing that literacy training, especially in rural communities. It's churches that are teaching that literacy, and so they've inculcated with that religious language. That's why they're using it rather than any religious passion. I'm not really sure that's entirely fair. I mean, yes, you're going to be much more inclined to write with that religious language if you learn literacy in that environment, but then you're also attending Holy Communion, you're also attending confession, you're also attending all these other things that help you gain an understanding of who you are, and if that cannonball hits you from one of Napoleon's daughters, as he called it, that's what you're going to want to understand those things. I mean, one of the fascinating things I'm probably going to look at next is looking at the blue light officer corps in the Royal Navy, where you've got junior officers of evangelical or Methodist dispositions working with evangelical chaplains to rapidly share the gospel amongst various ratings in the Royal Navy, and that system takes off very rapidly. And especially, even characters like Nelson speak quite positively of imbuing troops with an understanding of gospel virtues, of self-sacrifice, of commitment, of courage. So it's something that the Royal Navy actually in many sectors embrace. Wellington, because of the nature of operating in the peninsula, is so cautious regarding anything that's going to cause unrest. But to really go to the heart of your question, I mean, clearly some soldiers really do, really are committed to some calling of faith. I think one of the problems we have is that chaplaincy hasn't, and I say this as a chaplain, and again, Michael Snape is the official, really, the person in our department is a historian that's really worth speaking to on this topic. Chaplains by this point really haven't worked out exactly how they're conducting chaplaincy. And that's not a criticism, it's just it's a new theatre for them. And there's a lot of criticism of chaplains during this period in the Peninsular War. And so how soldiers relate to chaplaincy, there's a few negative things there. And so that might give us a negative understanding of their faith, but I don't think it does. If anything, soldiers are critical of the chaplains because they're like, well, no, this is not how ministers should behave, because we know how ministers should behave. So that to me says that they've got an understanding that actually their being Christian comes with an understanding of virtue, comes with an understanding of what it is to behave correctly. But yeah, we don't know. I mean, obviously, as a largely Protestant force, like with a significant Catholic element, that there's tensions there. But that's that's a topic for a wider day. I hope that somewhat helps.
Yeah, absolutely. It's further complicated, as you say. The by nature, or if you include Methodism as almost a separate religion, right? It's very much these tensions, and then you add in the tension of being in Catholic countries, and add in stories of soldiers, genuflecting in front of their Spanish hosts in the hope for better treatment, and it's just adds another complicated layer. But I'd like to switch gears a little bit, because I just noticed a question in the chat, so it's not much of a segue, but I'm just going to read this question out from, thank you, Matt. It's really interesting on a question about sort of class distinctions. And he says, would you say that this attraction of what you might call working or lower class men to the colors as a central icon of personal and group pride carries forward in a sociological sense to the British tradition of trade union banners, which I think it's a fascinating topic. It might be a little bit beyond what you've been researching here, but I'm almost going to suggest to Matt this could be somebody's PhD topic almost, but I'll let you give a shot at it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's great. It's a great question, and certainly, I mean, that's why I felt sort of called to look at Peterloo, right? Because you've got a lot of, I mean, there are several accounts of Peterloo that are quite dismissive of the contribution of Waterloo veterans. Actually, I think initially some historians have attributed quite a lot of the organisation of those rallies and the speakers to Waterloo veterans. Maybe it's been overstated, so there's been pushback there. But clearly, Waterloo veterans do have a sort of loss of identity, and I think it's so evident from the way that we read about them following their dismissal from the army. And to me, looking at Waterloo, looking at Quatre Bras and the Peninsular engagements, you can't then look at Peterloo with its procession, with its banners, with its sort of formational structure and go, these two things are entirely distinct. There's clearly overlap there. So I would say that yes. I'm not familiar. I've served with Canadian service persons. I'm not familiar with the sort of military tradition in Canada, but we have Legion clubs here in the UK, so it's a Royal British Legion.
Same here.
Same apologies for my ignorance on that. But they very much become local hubs for veterans, and often those hubs overlap with people that work in the same industry. And you'll go to British Legion clubhouses and there'll be flags and banners there. So I think that there's certainly some overlap. I struggle reading accounts of Peterloo and then trying to completely divorce it from the way that soldiers processed under their regimental colours. I think there's clearly an overlap there.
Great, thank you. I would be remiss. We have our famous drum major in our reenactment group on the chat with us as well. So I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the idea of regimental drums. And of course, in lots of those images you posted or you showed, drums are an integral part of the chaplain service as well, right? And often perform the role of an altar or even a lectern, right? Something like that. But they're still very central along with the colors. And I wonder if the drums, and even extending to the artillery, if the guns, if you found any evidence. To me, it doesn't feel quite the same, but it is very similar. So I thought I'd ask your opinion on drums and guns, if they have that same spirituality as colors.
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the things that I was interested in was not only how British soldiers had reverence for their own colours, but also how they prized capturing eagle colours, and that's why I've been fascinated by that wooden eagle in Chelmsford. That you know. That soldiers took the time to carve that out of the doorposts of a farmhouse that purportedly they defended. It's the same wood, but I'm taking that as writ. And I'd love to go to the museum and ask them some more questions about that. And I need to get around to that. And yeah, so capturing someone else's standard sort of relates to your identity, because we have captured this, we have overcome this great obstacle, and they now wear that badge on their uniform. And it's the same thing with drums and guns, exactly as you say. So at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, outside of Old College, you've got several cannons taken that British troops took from the Crimea during the conflict there. And also, there are cannons there from Waterloo. So when I commissioned, I hugged my family, and then I immediately went over to one of the Waterloo guns and got a picture in front of the Waterloo guns. Because that's amazing to me that we've got French guns there from Waterloo at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. And it's the same for drums. So yeah, I mean, I've served with artillery regiments, and they don't have, like you say, they don't have regimental colours. They have their guns, and it's a very interesting thing that we're in a stage, and I won't dwell on this too much, but where we are now moving on from different weapons platforms, from different types of artillery to new types of artillery, and that's because of what's going on at the moment. And I think you speak to gunners, and they feel that very deeply. They really care what style of weapon system are we getting. What is the new sort of artillery piece that we're getting? And it's more than utility, because it's part of who they are. It's really part of who they are. And you feel that very deeply when you talk to them. And drums, yeah. So for Christmas and for Easter, our band of drums come out, and they are this rallying point around which the regiments celebrate. They are quite rightly, as you say, used for solemn moments like the consecration of colours. But more often in contemporary regimental life, they're used at moments of celebration, because that's just the easiest place to use them. So like when we were deployed overseas, the colours stayed in the CO's office, but as you say, the drums were brought out, processed in the middle of the battalion and played. Yes, I think you could confer spiritual resonance with that, because clearly there's joy and a sense of identity taken from that. How much that relates to the colours, I would need to think about further.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. And I also, when you were talking about this carved wooden eagle, it's not entirely the same, but I was thinking about some of the like the ideas of the guards regiments wearing bearskins after Waterloo, or I think there's the story of the 5th Regiment wearing white hackles that they captured from the French. And the 42nd Red Hackle has a bit of a mysterious origins, but again, sort of this idea of capturing something from your enemy and then making it part of your own identity. I'm going to just one more question from the chat before I turn it over to Tom. Do you have any recommendations? I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly who asked this, but recommendations for further reading? Do you have sort of a literature list that you like to refer to, or anything you can suggest?
I mean, it's a great point. It's a very good question. I'm afraid I'm somewhat lacking. I mean, most of what I've done is looking at letters and sort of writing to libraries and trying to read letters and soldiers that I've done, and looking at journal articles. I mean, as I say, John A Lynn, most of his articles are published publicly. He writes very convincingly, I think, or wrote historically very convincingly on the way that soldiers related to French soldiers related to their imperial eagles. I mean, I found excerpts about British regimental colours in Napoleonic books, but I've not really found much of a focus. I mean, they're occasionally mentioned here and there, and I think what I've really tried to do is really try and draw a link historically, and I'm not the first one to do it by any means, but about spiritual convictions as a core part of soldiering. So, there's a really good book about the nature of chaplaincy and the way that the spiritual provision of chaplaincy contributes towards soldiering, and that's called Chaplaincy and Contention. So that's a book about British military chaplaincy. I think there's a few of our colleague chaplains from other nations as well in there, and that talks about the spiritual perspective of chaplains. But I actually, one of the reasons I presented on this topic is I don't think we attribute enough of our moral component of fighting power to spiritual foundations. And I absolutely agree with what you say, Chris. I don't think spirituality and religion are always the same. However, I think in our current age, this is why I referred to the title of the topic as In the Age of Enlightenment, that we're now in another age, not necessarily of enlightenment, but an age where we are very dismissive of metaphysical values. Like, unless something is proven and measurable and observable, it's not real. And I just think that would leave us with a very, very difficult job than teaching values and standards, and teaching about what courage is, what it is to look at enemy artillery and go, I'm just going to stand my ground, or I'm going to dig this trench and hold the line. Like, you need metaphysical properties to be able to develop the understanding that I've got a reason to fight. I'm protecting something. What I'm doing has meaning, has purpose. I don't subscribe to the notion that there's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole. Obviously there is. Anyone that's read First World War poetry knows that there are atheists in foxholes. However, part of my role at the moment is supporting the teaching of new entrant chaplains. And I was presenting 2 days ago on Market Garden on the Battle of Arnhem. And there's a story there of soldiers running out from one of the hospital first aid points they'd set up in Arnhem to go and pick up one of the RAF drops, thinking it will be food, thinking it will be ammunition or other vital supply. They open the capsule and it's maroon berets. But they felt the need to keep dropping maroon berets into Arnhem. Now, why would you do that? It was because the maroon beret means something. You speak to anyone in the British Airborne, and wearing that maroon beret is significant. You better not wear it unless you're in, you're in that environment. And so I think the reason I don't have specific reading material is because what I'm doing is drawing elements from lots of different points in history to try and tie in that spirituality is essential for soldiering. It's a bold claim, but I think there's a case for it.
Excellent. Well, that was Julia that asked that. And as we're wrapping up, I couldn't help but think how much a friend of ours would have enjoyed this. And Ray Hobbs was a reenactor. He was a professor at Divinity College at McMaster University. His specialty was warfare in the biblical war, but he liked digging into religion in Upper Canada during the War of 1812, and he'd studied and talked on the rise of Methodism in the regiments here in Canada as well. Ray would have loved this. It's another opportunity to remember Ray fondly. So thanks for this, Stuart. Very much appreciate you sharing your knowledge and passion. That was quite enjoyable. Thank you everyone for joining us today as we wrap up. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe to our channel. It doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't hurt. So, but it helps us out tremendously. So with that, everyone have a great afternoon, evening, wherever you might be, and we'll see you again soon. So take care.